So, hello and welcome. I am really excited and I'm really honored today to be speaking with you, Sharla. Thank you for being here.
You're welcome.
I'm really delighted to get to talk and hear and witness a little bit more deeply and to share that with others, a little bit of your journey and your experiences. We started working together seriously around understanding how the impact of previous traumas, both adult and from childhood, were kind of playing out in your life.
Yes.
And more recently, back in May, I did a real deep dive into understanding the nervous system together and learning how to heal and manage that in daily life. So you are obviously going to tell your story much better than I can. So I'm going to hand over to you and just ask you to share whatever's in your heart about what
Mhm.
was going on for you that brought you into a desire to start doing this work.
It's a pretty straightforward story, I think, insofar as especially women reaching a point in your life when you begin to recognize that a lot of the societal truths that you've been told about how you exist and enter the world are false. And the constructs around society that you were introduced to as a child were also false. And what that caused for me is this collapse of all of the dysregulation and traumas, phobias, anxieties, my clinical depression, my OCD, everything just kind of came at me at the same time. And because I work for myself, I spend the majority of my time by myself. And I easy environment to work with because I can deal with me pretty well. Towards the end of last year, early part of this year, one of my colleagues was experiencing his own level of dysregulation as it pertains to working with me. And typical child of trauma, I was like, oh, it must be my fault. Let me fix it. Um, and through the work that I've done with you, I understand much more fully that beyond the fact that it's not my fault, it actually isn't something that I personally have to engage with. Where it started to impact me directly was the level of dysregulation I would experience just hearing that person's voice. And so when we started to work together earlier this year, one of the core things you helped me to do is identify the emotion that makes me that kicks off the
Mm,
dysregulation.
mm.
And that's a big thing.
So let's talk about, if we can go in a little bit more just to describe for people, Sharla, what was going on. So you were, and just to the level of detail that you're comfortable with, but
Mm-hmm.
I think we were talking before we came on to this conversation about how it was the main obstacle, I guess, kind of getting to understanding that for you, there was a lot of anxiety and nervousness coming up around interacting with people at work. And particularly, as you've just talked about now, coming from that in your own home environment that COVID provided to a lot of people, and then
Mm-hmm.
relating face to face. So what did you feel like you didn't have yet, maybe a challenge in that context that you were facing that brought you into what you understood our work might unfold for you?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, interestingly enough, what I was experiencing with this particular colleague is a resurgence of some of the corporate dysfunction that I experienced in some of my previous roles and the traumas that can be created when you're working in environments that don't support you, don't see you, and are happy to cannibalize your work product as their original thought. And
And so that
this,
had happened to you. That's the background context. Yeah.
yes, that's it. That's the foundation for for not only working by myself, because I was made redundant from that role, and then less than 4.5, 5 months later, we have the pandemic, and it's like, oh my God, excuse me, this is great. I didn't realize that being in an office with that cacophony of noise and
Mm,
and all of those bright lights, etc., that the dysregulation I encountered there around being around other people was exactly the same thing.
mm,
And the pandemic afforded me the ability to recognize that being in a constant office environment is actually not helpful or healthy for me.
mm,
So when I started working with this and with these colleagues and this individual in particular, he began to exhibit some of the behaviors that I had previously encountered in my previous role that traumatized me and caused quite a lot of anxiety. And so when I was put in a position where I needed to work with that individual much more closely earlier this year, um, their behaviors, the behaviors that I had been excusing, were all quite literally thrust into my face all at the same time.
mm.
And I was not ready for that. I wasn't ready for it at all.
Mm.
I was, again, back in an office environment, lots of bright lights, lots of people around, and then there's this person.
Mm.
And so having all of these things come at me at the same time put me in a position where the dysregulation was just, it was literally on my sleeve every day while dealing with this individual in the first week. And we got to the point where I was just, it's not the way I like to work. And so having been exposed to the type of work that you do, I thought that while I was in your geographic region, it would be an excellent opportunity to try to take on board some of those skills
Mm.
and apply them to this particular working scenario.
Mm.
And it, you know, as you know, the first week was a mess. And
Before
second,
we did our sessions, yeah.
exactly. Week one was it was hot garbage, but as soon as we were able to start doing our sessions in conjunction with my psychologist, with my ADHD coach, having that foundation, that scaffolding around me helped me find the space between the emotional reaction and the physical
Mm.
manifestation of that emotional reaction.
So let's see if we can contrast that a little bit for people and even for us as we check in again today as well, Sharla, that difference of like what, because we tend to get into these technical terms and like, okay, so dysregulation, what did that look like for you when you were that hot mess that first week? What was happening?
I I become petulant.
Mm.
I and it is all in response to feeling as though the floor is falling out from underneath me. Like I am literally beginning to lose um, my tenuous connections with the physical world when I'm being triggered. And more often than not, I didn't realize that I was being triggered again until I started to work with you and recognize, you know, those two that those two paradigms were at work at the same time. But it was everything from, I don't know how to explain this other than to say it. Being a Black woman, being a woman of color in general, your facial expressions tend to read quite clearly. And with me, I recognize that my brain recognizes stupidity and it crosses my face before I have the opportunity to stop it from crossing my face. So what you tend to get a lot of is me looking at you crazy, left eyebrow of incredulity is like, oh, you know, very sarcastic behaviors start to manifest themselves. And then the rejection sensitive dysphoria kicks in. And that's when it is all over, because all of the horses have bolted the farm. And from that point forward, I begin crying uncontrollably, not for a few minutes, but for several hours. I am unable to stop it. And I experience a dysphonic response, a trauma-based response in my throat, where it begins to feel like I'm being strangled and it closes off. So in that work environment with this colleague, I basically had all of that hit me at once within 48 hours. And so the rest of the week was spent trying desperately to claw myself back out from that cavern that I'd fallen into. And exactly as you say, until the following week, when we were actually able to have our first session and have a conversation about the absolute shit show the previous week was, that I started to be able to I felt comfort, because I knew I was going to get help. I knew I was going to be helped. By the end of the first week, I was helped. And that set the tone for the last 3 weeks of my trip. And it made a massive difference.
So let's talk about that a little bit more as well. What did you notice shifted? What was then showing up when you were at work versus what you've just described? Thank you for being so open and vulnerable in describing all of that as well.
Of course. 2 things happened. That colleague went back home, and not having that physical presence took some of the anxiety away. But the other half of it was the the inch or two of emotional distance between what I hear and how my brain receives and translates that, and then what my body ends up doing with all of that information.
Beautiful. So that's the key that I really want to unpack a little bit more in terms of the actual work and what I'm hearing that came out of it for you. So your experience, what I'm really hearing is this space opened up for you. Suddenly there was like space to be able to realize that maybe the experiences that were happening weren't guaranteed and reality in the way things had to be, that there was possibility of something else, and then beginning to break down a little bit what was happening, like a trigger and a response and a body response and an emotion, and starting to develop that sophistication and that nuance. As you did that, and as you've continued to do that, Sharla, as you've continued to integrate both that kind of understanding and then also your experience, what's different in the way that you show up in the world now with work?
I think the key takeaway for me has been, and I don't want this to sound cliche, but it's real. That's the key takeaway. It's half of the experience for me, especially in those early moments of the rejection sensitive dysphoria or the trauma trigger, is my brain saying to me, this isn't real. You're putting on a show. You don't need to go through all of this. And what you helped me to recognize in that first week is the only reason that my body felt the way that it felt was because what was happening was actually happening. It wasn't in my head. And so being able to recognize that inner voice, that gut that I'm supposed to trust, she needs caveats, basically. Trust but verify is kind of what it's kind of what I walked away with.
I
Believe that the experience is happening, but verify that my reaction to this experience is not only I again, it's something else that you taught me, is that there's no such thing as an appropriate or inappropriate emotion. It is what the hell it is in the moment that it's happening. And that's the verification part for me, is this emotional reaction warranted based on the information that I have taken in. And I recognize that I'm not always going to be able to be in control of it. But now that I understand what it is, I am less frightened of it when it happens.
Beautiful. Were there any challenges? I guess, what were there any surprises or challenges that you encountered once we actually started doing the work in what you were experiencing, what you were being asked to do?
Absolutely. It gave me the ability to have conversations with people internally who had an inaccurate perception of who I was and how I entered the space of working with them in the first place. It allowed me to be able to say to these gentlemen, I am a person who exists with tick, 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 tick. And as a result, what you may see is not necessarily an accurate portrayal of what I am experiencing inside. And in that, because of that, please be mindful, not just of what you say or how you say it, but of how you see me react. Because that's how both you and I can support one another. And they were, beyond the fact that they were very they were actually, happy is probably the wrong word, but they were actually happy. They thanked me for disclosing that I'm a spousal abuse survivor, and all of those things, because they didn't understand why they saw what they were seeing. And until I put context to the physical reaction, they just thought I was nuts. It's fair. But having exposed myself in that way, having dropped that kimono, gave them some insight into what I struggle with. And as a result, it allowed them to create space for me as well. So if they see that I am having a reaction, they know that it's got likely to do nothing to do with them. And it's time that we stop talking and let's just take a break, reassess, everybody catch their breath. What's going on? What are you experiencing right now? Because something's happening, right? And giving me the courage to be able to have that conversation with them in the first place. It changed completely the tenor of my relationship with those gentlemen since the trip, and it changed the tenor of the rest of the trip, because we all had an understanding of each other's humanity, and that humanity does not look like what we have all been told humanity, especially on a corporate level, that humanity is supposed to look like. So it was the making space. It was the ability to be able to say truthfully, this is who I am and this is how I enter this world. And more importantly, giving people the opportunity to say, you know what, I understand. Because at the end of the day, if you never tell them, they will never know, and they will simply continue and persist in the behaviors that are harming you.
So I'm delighted to hear that, firstly. And I'd like to know, because you are somebody, as we talked about before, that's really on the journey and you've got other supports and there's a whole network. What is something in this work that we do, nervous system regulation, embodiment, resilience work, that really stands out for you most in what we did, that really struck you and stayed with you?
The resilience component. When I am experiencing the dysregulation, or when I feel like the floor is falling out from underneath me, I don't know that it's going to end. But working with you helped me understand that the resilience aspect isn't just about my ability to bounce back, but it's about my understanding of what I'm experiencing and contextualizing that experience in such a way that I am gentler with myself and have less of an instinctual response to say, just, tuck that away, don't deal with it right now. So that's the part I think I walked away with that has served me the most in the last 4 or 5 months.
Beautiful. If you were to recommend this work to anyone, what would you say? What would you say they might be able to experience or benefit from undertaking work with me like this?
I will tell you exactly what I've told the people.
Excellent.
Shut up and just book a session. Stop talking to me. Why are we having this discussion? I essentially, it's one of my very best friends. She experienced some pretty severe dysregulation while I was, in your geographic region working with you. And it was the first thing I said to her, all right, so you need to talk to Mira because the catastrophizing that your mind went straight for is because there was no space, not even the acknowledgement that space existed between the information you'd taken on board and the reaction that your body kicked off with. And she's like, oh my God, as soon as I have money in the space, it's like, just fine, figure it out, just figure it out. Because not only because I am a female business owner, but because I have to be clear on what I'm experiencing in order to make my working relationships productive and safe. So for her, I was really clear what I was able to walk away with is the knowledge that I don't have to sink into the catastrophe. And that really resonated with her. Because when our anxiety decides that it's going to take over, we don't get we don't get long at all between the initial sort of spark and the way our central nervous system takes off after that. So like I said, it was the first thing I said to her after talk to Mira is that this is not just because we have our own business, but because we don't know that we have the right to not have a response in the moment. So she took that and was very much literally the 24 hours later applied it, and she's like, I'm calm I'm calm today. And it's like, yes, because the initial reaction, although valid in the moment, didn't need to set the stage for how we continue to experience the issue that we were experiencing. And so, yeah, that's how I talk about you.
Thank you. And thank you so much for your time together. Before we close, is there anything that you feel like you want to share, like out into the world to let people know from your own experience, from your work with me, whatever comes to your heart that you might want to share to wrap up the session, this conversation?
Oh, look, you deserve to not feel the way that you feel. What you're experiencing is real. Even if nobody else around you understands that, what you're feeling is absolutely real, and you have the right to not feel that way. So,
Thank you.